For 30 years, Joel Goldsmith searched every religion, every philosophy, every healing method known to humanity. What he discovered in a moment of desperate silence changed everything we thought we knew about God, healing, and the very nature of reality itself. This wasn't just another spiritual teaching. Most people pray to God, asking for things, begging for help, hoping for miracles from some distant divine power. Joel discovered we've been approaching this completely backward for centuries. The revolutionary truth he uncovered doesn't just heal bodies. It transforms entire lives in ways that seem impossible. The secret isn't about getting God's attention or becoming worthy of divine love. It's about realizing something so profound, so simple, that when you truly understand it, physical healing, emotional freedom, and material abundance become natural expressions of what you already are. This discovery shattered every religious assumption Joel had ever held. It challenged the very foundation of traditional Christianity and opened a doorway to what he called the mystical path, a way of living that makes miracles ordinary and transforms every moment into a sacred encounter. Here's what Joel realized that night in 1946 during his deepest spiritual crisis. God isn't separate from you, waiting somewhere in heaven to be contacted through prayer or worship. God is your very consciousness when it's free from the illusion of separation. This isn't philosophy. This is practical foundation for miracles. Think about it carefully. Every time you've experienced peace, love, or sudden knowing that transcended your circumstances, you weren't contacting something outside yourself. You were experiencing your true nature without the interference of fear-based thinking. Joel called this the Christ within, your divine identity. When you stop seeking God out there and recognize the divine presence as your own consciousness expressing itself as your life, something extraordinary happens. Problems don't get solved through effort. They dissolve because you're no longer creating them from a place of separation and lack. This recognition changes everything about how you approach challenges, relationships, health, and abundance. You're no longer a limited human being seeking help from God. You're divine consciousness itself, expressing as your individual human experience. Joel discovered what he called the practicing of the presence. But this isn't meditation as most people know it. This is a radical shift in how you perceive reality moment by moment. You stop seeing yourself as a human being having occasional spiritual experiences during prayer or meditation. Instead, you begin recognizing yourself as spiritual consciousness having a human experience. When this recognition becomes natural rather than something you have to remember to do, your entire relationship with challenges, health, relationships, and abundance transforms at the core level. The practicing isn't something you do for 20 minutes in the morning and evening. It becomes the foundation from which you live every moment of your day. You begin to see through the appearances of discord to the underlying harmony that's always been present. You start recognizing that what you call problems are actually invitations to go deeper into truth. Every challenge becomes an opportunity to practice seeing through appearances to spiritual reality until this seeing becomes more natural than breathing itself. This is where Joel's teaching becomes revolutionary and challenges everything traditional religion has taught about the relationship between humanity and divinity. He taught that the moment you realize I and the Father are one, you stop being a person who needs healing and become the very presence that does the healing. You're not trying to get something from God. You are the God presence expressing itself as your individual consciousness. But here's the part most teachers miss completely. This realization doesn't happen through effort, technique, or years of spiritual practice. It happens through what Joel called resting in the silence of being. When thoughts stop trying to fix, change, or improve anything, when the mind releases its grip on outcomes and solutions, truth reveals itself naturally. A woman came to Joel with terminal cancer that doctors said was incurable. Instead of treating her condition, he sat with her in this silence of being. Within weeks, every trace of cancer had disappeared from her body. The doctors called it medically impossible. Joel knew it was spiritually inevitable once the illusion of separation dissolved and her true spiritual identity was recognized and experienced. Margaret had struggled with chronic pain for 15 years that dominated every aspect of her daily life. Doctors, specialists, alternative healers, pain management clinics, Nothing provided lasting relief. She'd tried every spiritual method imaginable, from positive thinking to energy healing, but the pain persisted relentlessly. When she finally encountered Joel's teaching through a friend, she was skeptical but desperate enough to try anything. The first breakthrough came not during formal meditation, but while washing dishes one ordinary Tuesday morning. She suddenly realized she'd been seeking healing as Margaret, the suffering person. In that moment of washing dishes, something extraordinary happened. Margaret, the person with chronic pain, disappeared from her awareness, and only pure awareness remained. Awareness without pain, without story, without the identity that had been suffering for 15 years. The pain was simply absent. Within 3 months, the chronic pain that had defined her life for 15 years was completely gone. But more than that, Margaret discovered she was living from a completely different foundation. Fear-based thinking had lost its grip on her consciousness entirely, and life became an adventure rather than an endurance test. Robert was facing complete financial ruin after 20 years of building his business. Bankruptcy papers were being prepared, creditors were calling daily, and his marriage was falling apart under the crushing weight of financial pressure. Traditional positive thinking and manifestation techniques had only made him feel more frustrated and hopeless. Joel taught him something radically different from anything he'd encountered in self-help or prosperity teachings. Instead of trying to demonstrate prosperity or attract abundance from outside himself, Robert learned to recognize the abundance that was already present in his consciousness as his spiritual birthright. He stopped seeing himself as lacking and needing to attract abundance from some external source. As Robert began living from this recognition of inherent wholeness rather than acquired prosperity, opportunities appeared naturally without force or struggle. His consciousness shifted from scarcity to abundance. Within 6 months, not only was his business thriving beyond his previous success, but his relationships had transformed because he was no longer operating from fear and desperation. He was expressing from fullness rather than grasping from emptiness, and life responded accordingly. Sarah had been battling severe depression for most of her adult life, spending years in therapy and trying various medications that provided some relief, but never addressed the underlying emptiness. She'd tried meditation, spiritual practices, self-help programs. Some provided temporary uplift, but nothing created lasting transformation. Through Joel's teaching, Sarah discovered that depression wasn't something wrong with her that needed to be fixed through treatment or positive thinking. It was the natural result of consciousness believing it was separate from its source, cut off from the love and wholeness that is its true nature. When this fundamental belief in separation dissolved through recognition of her true spiritual identity, depression couldn't maintain itself anymore. The shift happened gradually over several weeks as Sarah began experiencing moments of causeless joy and deep peace that had no external reason or trigger. These moments expanded and deepened until they became her natural state, rather than temporary experiences. The person who had been depressed for decades simply was no longer there. A new foundation for living had been established that was unshakable by external circumstances. James had been seeking spiritual truth for 20 years through various teachers, traditions, and practices. He'd had profound experiences, moments of awakening and deep peace, but somehow always seemed to fall back into old patterns of thinking and reacting to life's challenges with the same fears and frustrations. What Joel revealed changed everything about James's approach to spirituality. James realized he'd been treating spirituality as something he did rather than something he was. He'd been seeking enlightenment as a future attainment, rather than recognizing his true nature as already enlightened consciousness temporarily forgetting itself. The moment he stopped seeking enlightenment and recognized his true nature as already enlightened consciousness, simply having a temporary human experience, everything shifted permanently. The spiritual search ended not because he found what he was looking for, but because he realized he'd never actually lost it. James describes it as coming home to himself after 20 years of looking everywhere else for what had always been present. The seeking ended, but spiritual living began in a completely natural, effortless way that integrated seamlessly with daily human responsibilities and relationships. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. What healing journey resonated most with you? Beyond the primary realization of oneness, Joel developed what he called spiritual treatment. But this isn't treatment as most people understand it. This isn't sending thoughts, energy, or prayers to fix problems. It's recognizing the spiritual truth that dissolves the illusion, creating the appearance of the problem in the first place. When someone calls asking for help with a health challenge, financial crisis, or relationship conflict, a Joel Goldsmith practitioner doesn't try to heal the condition or solve the problem. Instead, they rest in the recognition that in spiritual truth, there is no person with a condition. There is only perfect spiritual being expressing. This recognition and consciousness has immediate and tangible effects in what we call the physical world. Symptoms disappear, relationships heal, financial situations resolve, not because something was sent to fix them, but because the truth of being dissolved the illusion that created the appearance of discord. The practitioner becomes a transparency for truth rather than a person trying to help another person. This complete shift in identity from helper to transparency for divine consciousness is what makes Joel's approach to healing so remarkably effective and permanent. Joel taught what he called spiritual discernment, the developed ability to see beyond appearances to spiritual reality in every situation you encounter. When you look at a magnificent sunset, you're not simply seeing colored light hitting particles in the atmosphere. You're witnessing infinite beauty expressing itself in form. This same discernment applies to everything in your experience throughout the day. When you see lack, discord, disease, or limitation, you're looking at appearances that have no spiritual reality. Spiritual discernment reveals the underlying perfection that's always present, always available to be experienced by consciousness. The practice isn't about denying what appears to be happening or pretending problems don't exist. It's about recognizing what's really happening behind the appearances. Divine consciousness expressing itself perfectly, even when that perfection is temporarily obscured by limited perception. This recognition naturally transforms your experience without effort or struggle. You don't change the appearances, you see through them to reality, and the appearances naturally align with the truth you're recognizing rather than the illusion you were believing. One of Joel's most powerful and transformative techniques was what he called the art of dying daily. This isn't about physical death. It's about the daily dying of the personal sense of self that believes it's separate from God, from good, from the wholeness that is its true nature. Every time you catch yourself thinking as a person who lacks something, needs something, or fears something, you can let that personal sense die in that moment. In its place, you recognize yourself as the very presence of completeness, expressing itself as your individual experience of life. This dying to the personal sense becomes so natural and automatic that you begin living from spiritual identity rather than human identity, without effort or constant remembering. From this foundation, what humans call miracles become normal, natural expressions of what you actually are. The daily practice of dying to limitation and being reborn to truth creates a momentum of transformation that eventually becomes self-sustaining. You no longer have to work at being spiritual. You simply are spiritual consciousness expressing as human experience. Joel discovered that the key to permanent transformation lies in what he called the middle path, living fully human while knowing yourself as divine consciousness. You don't transcend the human experience or escape into some ethereal spiritual realm. You live human life from your true spiritual foundation. This means you pay your bills, maintain your relationships, care for your body, and fulfill your responsibilities. But you do all of this from the recognition of your true nature rather than from fear, lack, or the belief that you're separate from infinite good. The middle path dissolves the old spiritual misconception that you must choose between being spiritual and being practical. You become supremely practical because you're operating from truth rather than illusion, from abundance rather than limitation, from love rather than fear. Daily life becomes a continuous expression of spiritual principles rather than a distraction from them. Work becomes worship, relationships become holy encounters, and the most ordinary activities become opportunities to express divine creativity and love. But let's be completely honest about the challenges you'll face as you begin living these truths. The mind that's been conditioned for years or decades to think in terms of separation, lack, and limitation doesn't instantly embrace these revolutionary ideas. You might experience what Joel called periods of spiritual dryness. During these challenging times, the old thinking patterns seem to return with a vengeance. You might doubt everything you've learned, feel like you're back where you started, or wonder if any of this spiritual understanding is real or just wishful thinking and self-deception. Joel taught that these periods are actually signs of genuine progress, not failure or spiritual regression. They're the final attempts of conditioned thinking to maintain its grip on your consciousness. The key is not to fight these experiences, but to continue resting in truth even when you don't feel it. These dark nights of the soul, as mystics have called them, are temporary and necessary parts of the transformation process. They're opportunities to prove that your spiritual understanding doesn't depend on feeling good or having positive experiences. Another common challenge that can derail spiritual progress is what Joel called spiritual pride, the subtle tendency to believe you're more evolved, more enlightened, or spiritually superior to others who haven't discovered these truths. This form of separation can actually block your continued spiritual unfoldment. The antidote to spiritual pride is genuine humility, recognizing that spiritual understanding is a gift of grace, not a personal achievement or accomplishment. You didn't earn or deserve this awareness any more than you earned the ability to breathe or your heart's ability to beat automatically. When spiritual pride arises, and it will arise subtly even in sincere seekers, return immediately to the simplicity of gratitude. Be grateful that truth is revealing itself through your consciousness, and let that gratitude dissolve any sense of spiritual superiority or separation from others. Remember that everyone is the same divine consciousness expressing at different levels of recognition. Your role is to be transparent for truth, not to judge others' spiritual development or try to convince them of what you've discovered. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of Joel's teaching is learning to live without the mental habit of trying to use spiritual truth to get something. The conditioned mind wants to turn these principles into techniques for manifesting desires, solving problems, or achieving better life circumstances. But the moment you try to use truth to get something, you've stepped back into the consciousness of separation. You've become a person who lacks something and is trying to use spirituality to acquire it. True spiritual living means recognizing that you already are everything you could ever need or want. This doesn't mean desires disappear or that you become passive about improving your life circumstances. It means your desires arise from fullness rather than emptiness, and their fulfillment happens naturally as expressions of what you are, rather than acquisitions by who you think you are. The shift from using truth to being truth is subtle but crucial. When you are truth expressing, your life naturally reflects that truth without effort, manipulation, or trying to make things happen through spiritual techniques. The ultimate challenge in Joel's path is what he called the final sacrifice, giving up even the desire for spiritual experiences, spiritual progress, or advanced spiritual understanding. As long as you're seeking something spiritual, you're maintaining the illusion of separation from what you seek. The resolution comes through grace, spontaneous moments when seeking stops not because you found what you were looking for, but because you suddenly realize the seeker and the sought are one and have always been one. These moments of grace can't be produced through effort, but they can be welcomed. When you stop trying to become spiritual and simply rest in what you are right now, the spiritual nature of your being reveals itself naturally. This is the end of the spiritual path because you realize there was never anywhere to go or anything to attain. The final sacrifice leads to the ultimate freedom, living without spiritual seeking while being constantly aware of your spiritual nature. You become ordinary in the most extraordinary way, completely human while completely divine. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment. Which obstacle are you ready to transform now? Living Joel's teaching in daily life means bringing this consciousness of oneness into every situation, relationship, and challenge you encounter. When your coworker irritates you with their behavior, instead of reacting from personality and old conditioning, you recognize the Christ in them, and the Christ as your own true identity. This isn't about being nice, tolerant, or spiritually correct. It's about seeing through the personal appearances to spiritual reality. When you consistently see from this perspective, relationships become harmonious not because people change their behavior to please you, but because you're seeing their true nature. At work, Instead of competing, manipulating, or struggling for advancement, you express your spiritual qualities, creativity, wisdom, love, intelligence, naturally and authentically. Opportunities arise because you're being authentic spiritual expression rather than a personality trying to get something. Your presence at work becomes uplifting to others, not because you're preaching or teaching spirituality, but because you're living from a foundation of peace and wholeness that others unconsciously recognize and are drawn to. In parenting, Joel's principles create profound harmony and understanding between parents and children. Instead of seeing your children as people you need to control, guide, or fix, you recognize them as spiritual beings expressing their divine nature through the temporary experience of childhood. This recognition allows you to guide and discipline from love rather than fear, from wisdom rather than control. Children respond to this spiritual recognition with natural cooperation because they're being seen and treated as the divine beings they actually are, not just as small humans with problems. Family conflicts resolve more easily because you're not taking personal behavior personally. You see through temporary emotional expressions to the permanent spiritual identity of each family member. This doesn't mean you become permissive. It means you respond from wisdom rather than reaction. The home becomes a sanctuary where everyone feels safe to express their authentic nature because they're being seen and loved for what they are, rather than judged for what they do or don't do. Financial challenges become opportunities to prove spiritual principles in practical, tangible ways. Instead of seeing money as something external you need to attract, earn, or struggle for, you recognize abundance as the very nature of infinite consciousness, expressing itself as your experience. This doesn't mean becoming passive about money or ignoring practical responsibilities. It means approaching financial obligations and opportunities from spiritual abundance rather than material lack. You make wise decisions, work diligently, and manage resources responsibly from fullness rather than fear. Many practitioners find that as they live from this recognition of inherent abundance, their financial situations naturally improve not through struggle, manifestation techniques, or trying to attract money, but as natural expressions of the abundance they recognize themselves to be. Money becomes a tool for expressing love rather than a source of security or identity. This shift in relationship to money often results in greater financial freedom because decisions are made from wisdom rather than fear or greed. Physical health becomes a natural expression of spiritual wholeness when you begin recognizing your body as the visible expression of perfect spiritual being, rather than a material thing that can get sick or break down. This recognition transforms your entire approach to health and healing. This understanding doesn't replace medical care when needed, but it provides the spiritual foundation that supports all healing, whether through medicine, natural methods, or spontaneous resolution. You work with healthcare providers from wisdom rather than fear, making decisions from wholeness rather than desperation. The body responds to being seen and treated as spiritual rather than merely material. Many practitioners report improved health, increased vitality, and faster healing as natural results of living from spiritual identity rather than material identification. You begin to understand that symptoms are often consciousness expressing imbalance, and as consciousness returns to its natural state of wholeness, the body naturally reflects that harmony. Health becomes normal rather than something you have to work to maintain. As Joel's teaching becomes your natural way of being rather than something you practice, you discover what he called the healing consciousness. You begin to have a positive, uplifting effect on everyone you encounter, often without saying anything specifically spiritual or trying to help anyone. People are naturally drawn to the peace they feel in your presence. They open up, share their challenges, and often find their own solutions simply through being around someone who is resting in spiritual truth, rather than reacting from personal conditioning and fear. This healing presence becomes so natural that you often don't realize you're having this effect on others. You're simply being yourself, your true spiritual self, and that authenticity creates space for others to connect with their own truth and find their own answers. You become a living demonstration of spiritual principles rather than someone who talks about them. This demonstration is far more powerful than any words because people can feel the reality of what you've discovered through your presence. Years of living these principles consistently create what Joel called spiritual stability, the developed ability to remain centered in truth regardless of external circumstances. Economic upheavals, health challenges, relationship conflicts no longer throw you into emotional chaos or mental confusion. You respond to life's inevitable challenges with wisdom and love because you're responding from spiritual identity rather than personal reaction. This doesn't mean you become emotionless or detached. It means your emotions arise from truth rather than illusion. This stability becomes a precious gift to everyone in your life. In times of crisis, you naturally become a source of calm, wisdom, and practical guidance because you're seeing clearly rather than reacting from fear or personal attachment to specific outcomes. People learn to trust your perspective because it comes from a place of spiritual discernment rather than personal opinion or emotional reaction. You become someone others can depend on for balanced, loving guidance. The ultimate fruit of Joel's teaching is what he called the mystical life, living in constant conscious communion with the divine presence that you are. Prayer becomes an ongoing recognition of truth rather than periodic asking for help, guidance, or intervention from an external God. Every moment becomes an opportunity to witness infinite love expressing itself as your experience and the experience of everyone around you. Work becomes worship, relationships become holy encounters, and the most ordinary activities become expressions of divine creativity. You realize that the mystical life isn't separate from ordinary human life. It's ordinary human life lived from your true spiritual identity. Nothing in your external circumstances needs to change except the foundation from which you perceive and respond to everything. The mystical life is available to everyone because everyone is spiritual consciousness expressing as individual human experience. Joel's teaching shows you how to recognize and live from this truth consistently. This is what Joel Goldsmith uncovered in that moment of desperate silence. Not a new religion, spiritual practice, or self-improvement technique, but the eternal truth of what you've always been beneath the layers of conditioning, seeking, and spiritual effort. You are divine consciousness individualized, expressing as your unique human experience. The journey doesn't end with understanding these principles intellectually or having occasional spiritual experiences. It begins with living them moment by moment until they become more natural than breathing, more automatic than your heartbeat. This is your birthright, your true identity, your permanent spiritual foundation. You don't need to become spiritual, achieve enlightenment, or earn God's love. You need to stop believing you're anything other than the spiritual being you've always been. When this recognition becomes your natural state of consciousness, you discover that everything you ever sought through spirituality has always been your own true nature. The search ends, but life begins. Life lived from the foundation of truth, rather than the quicksand of illusion. This is Joel Goldsmith's gift to humanity, the recognition that what we seek, we are. What we hope to become, we already are. What we long for, we have never been without. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path. There's a spiritual practice Joel Goldsmith taught that made religious institutions so uncomfortable. Some denominational leaders actually warned their congregations against it. Not because it was dangerous, but because it worked without needing their permission, their buildings, or their approval. This practice gave ordinary people direct access to healing power. What terrified these institutions wasn't the technique itself. It was that people began experiencing genuine transformation without intermediaries, without rituals, without the structures that kept them dependent. Joel called this practice impersonalization, and it dissolved problems that years of traditional prayer couldn't touch. The controversy started in the 1950s when Joel's students began sharing remarkable healing experiences. Physical conditions improved, relationships transformed, financial struggles resolved, all through a practice that required nothing external. Just a shift in how you perceive the person or situation before you. Impersonalization means recognizing that what appears as a problem in another person isn't actually them. It's an impersonal belief operating through them, a universal suggestion that has no real power or presence. You stop fighting the person and start seeing through the illusion that has temporarily attached itself to their human appearance. When Amanda looked at her aggressive colleague Brian, she stopped seeing him as the problem. She began recognizing that aggression itself was an impersonal force, a belief in separation and fear that could operate through anyone. Brian wasn't inherently aggressive. He was temporarily expressing an impersonal pattern that had no spiritual reality or legitimate existence. This recognition didn't require Amanda to confront Brian, pray for him in traditional ways, or try to change him through mental effort. She simply held the awareness that the spiritual identity of Brian remained untouched by this temporary human expression. The impersonal nature of the problem meant it had no real attachment to him as an individual being. The practice works because consciousness creates experience. When you impersonalize, you stop feeding the false appearance with your belief that it's real and permanent. You withdraw your mental agreement that this person is the problem, recognizing instead that they're experiencing a temporary suggestion that has no power except what human belief gives it through sustained attention. Joel discovered this principle through years of spiritual practice and mystical insight. He found that when you stop personalizing problems, they lose their grip on your experience. The person you were struggling with suddenly changes, not because you tried to change them, but because you changed your perception of what was actually happening in consciousness. Religious authorities resisted this teaching because it bypassed their entire system. You didn't need absolution, rituals, or someone else's prayers. You needed clear spiritual vision that recognized the impersonal nature of all discord, disease, and dysfunction. This vision was available to anyone willing to practice it consistently over time, with patience and dedication. Here's how the practice unfolds in daily life. When someone criticizes you harshly, your first impulse is to defend yourself or attack back. But impersonalization asks you to pause and recognize that criticism itself is an impersonal suggestion of inadequacy or judgment-seeking expression through this person. They're not the source, they're the temporary channel for something impersonal. This recognition doesn't make you passive or weak. It makes you spiritually intelligent. You respond to the situation appropriately while maintaining inner awareness that the spiritual identity of this person remains perfect and untouched. The human behavior is temporary. The spiritual reality is permanent and unchanging despite appearances. Within days or weeks of practicing this consistently, you'll notice the relationship shifts. The person becomes less aggressive, less critical, or circumstances naturally separate you, not through manipulation or mental force, but through the natural outworking of consciousness recognizing truth. The impersonal pattern simply loses its power to operate through that individual in your presence and experience. Daniel was a hospital administrator dealing with a board member named Nicole who opposed every initiative he proposed. For 6 months, meetings became battlegrounds. Daniel tried diplomacy, tried avoiding her, tried building alliances against her. Nothing worked. Nicole seemed personally committed to blocking his vision for patient care improvements. Then Daniel encountered Joel Goldsmith's impersonalization practice through a friend's recommendation. The concept seemed too simple to work against such persistent opposition, but Daniel was desperate enough to try anything. He began practicing during his morning meditation, recognizing that Nicole's opposition wasn't personal, but an impersonal belief in limitation and control-seeking expression. For 3 weeks, Daniel practiced this recognition daily. He didn't change his proposals or his approach to board meetings. He simply maintained the inner awareness that Nicole's spiritual identity remained perfect, untouched by the impersonal pattern of resistance operating through her human behavior. He stopped seeing her as the enemy and started seeing through the impersonal nature of opposition itself. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a routine budget meeting. Nicole suddenly supported one of Daniel's proposals, offering constructive modifications rather than automatic rejection. Other board members looked surprised. Daniel maintained his inner practice, recognizing this shift as the natural result of consciousness responding to truth rather than personal manipulation. Over the following 2 months, Nicole became one of Daniel's strongest allies. She never acknowledged the shift, never apologized for past opposition. The change happened organically as the impersonal pattern lost its power to operate through her in Daniel's experience. The hospital implemented patient care improvements that benefited thousands. Joel taught that this is how impersonalization works in the real world, not through dramatic confrontations or overnight miracles, but through gradual shifts in consciousness that naturally produce changes in experience. The timeline varies. Some situations shift quickly. Others require weeks or months of consistent practice before visible results emerge in your daily life. Kevin struggled with chronic lower back pain that doctors couldn't fully explain. Physical therapy helped temporarily, but the pain always returned. His physician suggested the problem might have stress components, but traditional stress management techniques provided minimal relief. Kevin was considering surgery despite the uncertain prognosis and significant recovery time. A friend introduced Kevin to Joel Goldsmith's teachings on impersonalizing disease. The concept challenged everything Kevin believed about physical healing. How could recognizing pain as impersonal change a physical condition? Yet pharmaceutical options were exhausted, and Kevin was willing to explore alternatives before committing to surgery with questionable outcomes. Kevin began practicing daily. Instead of fighting the pain or identifying himself as a chronic pain sufferer, he recognized that pain itself was an impersonal suggestion of separation from wholeness. The pain wasn't him, wasn't his identity, wasn't his permanent reality. It was a temporary impersonal pattern passing through his experience. After 6 weeks of consistent practice, Kevin noticed the pain intensity decreasing. Not dramatically, not overnight, but gradually and steadily. By 3 months, he functioned normally most days. His physician was surprised but attributed it to delayed response from previous physical therapy. Kevin knew differently. He had changed his consciousness about pain itself. The practice didn't replace medical care. Kevin continued appropriate physical activity and professional consultation. But impersonalization added a spiritual dimension that addressed the consciousness component of physical experience. Kevin learned that many conditions have both physical and consciousness elements, and addressing consciousness can support overall healing in ways purely physical treatments sometimes cannot. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's forbidden practice. Subscribe for more mystical Christianity wisdom that denominations tried to suppress, and comment which story resonated most with your current situation. Beyond impersonalization, Joel taught a complementary practice called recognition. While impersonalization removes false beliefs about others, recognition establishes spiritual truth about their real identity. Together, these practices create a complete approach to consciousness transformation that addresses both the removal of error and the establishment of truth simultaneously. Recognition means consciously acknowledging the spiritual perfection already present. When you look at someone struggling with addiction, disease, or dysfunction, recognition sees past the human appearance to the divine consciousness that constitutes their actual being. This isn't positive thinking or denial. It's spiritual vision that perceives what's eternally true despite temporary appearances. Jonathan practiced recognition with his sister Ashley, who struggled with severe anxiety. Instead of focusing on her symptoms or trying to fix her mentally, Jonathan held recognition of her spiritual completeness. He didn't announce this practice to her or make it obvious. He simply maintained the inner awareness during their conversations and family interactions. The recognition practice doesn't require the other person's cooperation or awareness. You're not sending them thoughts or trying to influence them mentally. You're simply aligning your consciousness with spiritual truth about their identity. This alignment naturally affects the field of consciousness you share, creating space for their healing without any manipulation or mental force directed at them. Ashley began improving over several months. Her anxiety attacks decreased in frequency and intensity. She attributed the improvement to therapy and medication adjustments, and Jonathan never corrected her. The important thing wasn't who received credit, but that Ashley's quality of life improved as Jonathan maintained recognition of her spiritual perfection consistently. Joel emphasized that recognition works alongside traditional care, not as a replacement. Ashley's therapy provided practical tools, her medication supported brain chemistry, and Jonathan's recognition addressed the consciousness dimension. All three contributed to her overall healing process. Spiritual practice complements professional care rather than competing with it in most situations. Another complementary technique Joel taught was meditation on spiritual identity. This differs from traditional meditation that seeks peace or clarity. This meditation establishes conscious awareness of your own divine nature, which then radiates into your experience naturally. You're not trying to change your circumstances. You're recognizing the consciousness that creates circumstances. Michelle spent 20 minutes each morning in this meditation. She didn't ask for anything, didn't visualize outcomes, didn't repeat affirmations. She simply rested in awareness of consciousness itself as her true identity. The infinite, eternal, perfect consciousness that Joel called the Christ within. The presence of God as individual being and awareness. This practice seemed passive, but Michelle discovered its power through consistent application over months. Her business challenges resolved not through her efforting but through opportunities and connections that emerged naturally. Her health improved without dramatic interventions. Her relationships deepened as she stopped trying to control them and simply maintained awareness of spiritual perfection. The meditation practice supports both impersonalization and recognition by establishing your own consciousness in truth. When you're anchored in awareness of your spiritual identity, impersonalizing others becomes natural. You automatically see through false appearances because you're not caught in them yourself. Recognition flows easily because you're conscious of the divine nature you're recognizing in everyone. Richard combined all three practices into his daily spiritual routine. Morning meditation established his consciousness in truth. Throughout the day, he impersonalized challenges and recognized spiritual perfection in others. This comprehensive approach created a consciousness that naturally manifested harmony, health, and wholeness. Not instantly, not magically, but progressively over weeks and months of consistent practice. Joel taught that spiritual development is gradual. You don't master these practices overnight. Some days are easier than others. Some situations respond quickly. Others require persistent practice over extended periods. The key is consistency, returning to the practice daily regardless of immediate visible results. Consciousness transformation precedes experience transformation, sometimes by weeks or months before you see the evidence. The most common challenge with impersonalization is the temptation to make it a mental technique to manipulate others. You practice impersonalization, hoping the difficult person will change or leave your life. This motivation corrupts the practice because you're still personalizing the problem, just using a spiritual technique to try to control it mentally. Brandon struggled with this for months. He practiced impersonalization toward his manager, Anthony, hoping Anthony would quit or transfer. When nothing changed after several weeks, Brandon felt the practice failed. He didn't realize his motivation was still rooted in personal manipulation, rather than genuine spiritual recognition of truth regardless of outcomes. A Joel Goldsmith teacher helped Brandon understand the subtle difference. Impersonalization isn't about getting what you want through spiritual techniques. It's about seeing truth clearly and letting that truth naturally govern your experience. The outcome might be Anthony changing, or you changing, or the situation resolving through unexpected means. You release attachment to specific results. Another obstacle is inconsistency. You practice impersonalization when you're angry or frustrated, but forget it when things calm down. This sporadic approach produces sporadic results. The impersonal pattern returns because you haven't established consistent consciousness that sees through it permanently. Joel emphasized that consciousness work requires the same consistency as physical exercise for lasting benefits. Samantha discovered this through her practice with a neighbor named Ryan who played loud music late at night. She would impersonalize during conflicts, feel better temporarily, but then slip back into personalizing Ryan as the problem when the music started again. The pattern continued because her practice was reactive rather than proactive and consistent. When Samantha began practicing impersonalization daily regardless of whether Ryan played music that night, the situation transformed. Her consciousness shifted from reactive anger to stable spiritual recognition. Ryan either began using headphones or Samantha stopped being disturbed by the music. The exact mechanism didn't matter because her experience changed through changed consciousness maintained consistently. A third challenge is expecting instant results. You practice for a few days or weeks, and when the situation doesn't immediately change, you conclude the practice doesn't work. But consciousness transformation operates on its own timeline. Some patterns dissolve quickly. Others are deeply entrenched and require months of consistent practice before visible shifts emerge. Angela practiced impersonalization toward her adult daughter Catherine, who struggled with addiction. After 2 months with no visible improvement, Angela felt discouraged. A spiritual counselor reminded her that addiction involves complex physical, emotional, and consciousness components. Spiritual practice supports healing, but doesn't replace professional treatment or guarantee specific timelines. Angela continued practicing for 8 more months. Gradually, Catherine began making different choices. She entered treatment, completed the program, and began rebuilding her life. The timeline was longer than Angela hoped, but the outcome was genuine. Joel taught that spiritual practice works with divine timing, not human impatience. Your role is consistent practice, not controlling outcomes or timelines. Perhaps the deepest challenge is practicing impersonalization when you're the one being impersonalized negatively by others. Someone judges you, criticizes you, or treats you unfairly. Can you recognize that their judgment is an impersonal pattern, not the truth about you? Can you maintain awareness of your spiritual identity while they're attacking your human personality? Timothy faced this when colleagues spread false rumors about his professional competence. His reputation suffered, his career advancement stalled. The temptation was to defend himself aggressively or retreat in shame. Instead, Timothy practiced impersonalizing both the colleagues and the rumors themselves, recognizing that false judgment was an impersonal pattern without legitimate power or reality. The practice required months of inner discipline. Timothy addressed the situation appropriately at work while maintaining spiritual recognition that his true identity remained untouched. Eventually, the truth emerged naturally, his reputation restored. But the real victory was Timothy's consciousness remaining stable throughout the crisis through consistent spiritual practice, regardless of external circumstances. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this wisdom being shared freely, subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith practices denominations didn't want you to know, and comment which obstacle you're ready to transform through impersonalization now. Advanced practitioners learn to impersonalize their own negative patterns. When you catch yourself being judgmental, fearful, or resentful, you can recognize these as impersonal patterns operating through you temporarily. You're not a judgmental person, you're experiencing an impersonal suggestion of judgment. This recognition allows the pattern to dissolve without guilt or self-condemnation weighing you down. William discovered this application after years of practicing impersonalization toward others. He realized he could apply the same principle to his own anger issues. Instead of identifying as an angry person who needed fixing, William recognized anger itself as an impersonal force-seeking expression. This shift allowed him to observe anger arising without claiming it as his identity. Over 6 months, William's anger responses diminished dramatically, not through suppression or psychological techniques, but through consistent spiritual recognition that anger was impersonal, temporary, and not his true nature. When anger arose, William impersonalized it the same way he had learned to impersonalize others' negative behaviors toward him. Joel taught that you can impersonalize social and political conflicts. When you read news of violence, corruption, or injustice, you can recognize these as impersonal patterns of belief in separation, fear, and lack operating through collective human consciousness. This doesn't make you passive or uncaring. It makes you spiritually intelligent about the true nature of collective challenges. Emily practiced this during intense political divisions in her community. Instead of demonizing those with opposing views, she recognized that divisiveness itself was an impersonal pattern, seeking expression through everyone, regardless of political affiliation. This recognition didn't change her own convictions, but it freed her from the hatred and fear that poisoned others' experience of community life. Emily participated in community dialogue events, bringing a consciousness of spiritual unity beneath surface disagreements. She didn't convert anyone to her political views, but her presence created space for respectful exchange. Several participants later mentioned that conversations with Emily felt different, more human, less combative. Her impersonalization practice created an atmosphere where others could connect beyond their differences. Advanced impersonalization extends to global challenges. Poverty, disease, war, and environmental destruction appear as massive problems beyond individual influence. But Joel taught that all discord is impersonal, operating at whatever scale human consciousness allows through collective belief and agreement. Your individual practice of recognizing the impersonal nature of these challenges contributes to collective consciousness shift. Nathan worked in international development, confronting poverty and corruption daily. The enormity of suffering overwhelmed him until he began practicing impersonalization. He recognized that poverty consciousness was an impersonal belief in lack and limitation, not the spiritual truth about any community or nation. Corruption was impersonal greed and fear, not the essential nature of any individual leader. This recognition didn't make Nathan naive about systemic challenges or reduce his practical efforts. It gave him spiritual stability to continue the work without despair. His projects became more effective because he approached communities recognizing their spiritual capacity rather than focusing solely on their human limitations. Results improved over several years as Nathan's consciousness influenced the entire organization's approach. The practice ultimately reveals that there's no separation between spiritual and practical life. Impersonalization isn't something you do during meditation and then forget in daily activities. It becomes your natural way of perceiving reality. You automatically see through surface appearances to the spiritual truth underlying all experience. This vision transforms everything without constant effort. Vanessa reached this stage after 3 years of consistent practice. She no longer had to remind herself to impersonalize or recognize. When challenges arose, her consciousness naturally perceived their impersonal nature and spiritual reality simultaneously. Problems still occurred, but they no longer had the same power to disturb her inner stability or overwhelm her peace. Joel called this state of consciousness spiritual maturity. You're not trying to be spiritual or practice techniques. You're living from spiritual consciousness as your natural state. The human experience continues with its challenges and joys, but you're anchored in awareness that transcends and includes the human level. This is the goal of all spiritual practice, not escape from life, but transformation of consciousness that naturally transforms experience. The forbidden nature of Joel's teaching wasn't about the practice itself, but about the implications. If anyone can access healing power directly through consciousness, what need do they have for institutional intermediaries? If spiritual truth is available through individual recognition, what authority do denominations hold over people's spiritual lives and development? Laura attended a church for years before discovering Joel's teachings. When she shared her experiences with impersonalization and the healing that followed, church leaders warned her against pursuing these practices. They claimed she was falling into dangerous spiritual territory, but Laura recognized their fear wasn't about her safety. It was about losing control over her spiritual authority. Joel faced similar resistance throughout his teaching career. He was asked to leave certain spiritual organizations because his message of individual direct access to divine consciousness threatened hierarchical structures. But Joel persisted because he knew the truth he taught was too valuable to suppress. Thousands experienced genuine transformation through practices that required nothing but willingness and consistency. Today, Joel Goldsmith's teachings continue spreading despite institutional resistance. People discover these practices through books, recordings, online resources, and direct spiritual experience. The forbidden becomes accessible to anyone seeking truth beyond traditional religious frameworks. You don't need permission, credentials, or approval to practice impersonalization and recognition. You need only commitment to consistent application. Matthew discovered Joel's work during a personal crisis when traditional religious approaches failed him. The impersonalization practice seemed radical, even heretical. But Matthew was desperate enough to try it consistently for several months. His crisis resolved, not through miracle intervention, but through gradual consciousness transformation that naturally changed his experience. Now Matthew shares these teachings with others facing similar struggles. Some are receptive, others resist. Matthew doesn't force the information or argue with skeptics. He simply shares what worked in his own experience and lets others decide for themselves. This is Joel's approach. Offer truth, demonstrate through living example, and allow individual choice without manipulation or pressure. The practice requires no special circumstances or abilities. You don't need to be spiritually advanced, highly educated, or free from problems to begin. You start exactly where you are, with whatever challenges you're facing. Each challenge becomes an opportunity to practice impersonalization and recognition. Each difficulty becomes a classroom for consciousness transformation through consistent application. Christina started practicing while dealing with chronic illness, financial stress, and family conflicts simultaneously. She didn't wait until life improved to begin spiritual practice. She practiced in the midst of challenges, sometimes barely maintaining awareness for a few minutes at a time. But those minutes accumulated into hours, days, weeks of shifted consciousness over time. 2 years later, Christina's circumstances had transformed significantly. Her health stabilized, finances improved, family relationships healed. But the real transformation was Christina's consciousness. She had developed spiritual stability that could weather any storm, because she no longer identified with circumstances. She recognized herself as the consciousness that creates and experiences circumstances from spiritual awareness. Joel Goldsmith's forbidden practice remains available to you right now. You don't need to join anything, believe anything specific, or change your current spiritual path. You simply need to begin practicing impersonalization and recognition consistently in your daily life. Start with one challenging person or situation. Practice seeing through the impersonal nature of the problem. Practice recognizing spiritual perfection beneath human appearances. Some days will feel powerful, others will feel like nothing's happening. Continue anyway. Some situations will shift quickly, others will require months of practice. Continue anyway. Your consciousness is transforming even when you don't see immediate evidence. Trust the process, trust the practice. Trust that consciousness creates experience, and changed consciousness naturally produces changed experience. The denominations tried to stop this teaching because they recognized its power to liberate individuals from dependence on external spiritual authority. But truth cannot be stopped. It spreads from consciousness to consciousness, from practice to practice, from transformation to transformation. You are part of that spreading truth right now, reading these words, considering these practices, preparing to transform your own consciousness and experience through Joel's forbidden wisdom. If your spiritual understanding expanded through Joel Goldsmith's forbidden practices, like this video to help others break free from institutional limitations, subscribe for more suppressed mystical Christianity teachings, and comment, "I practice impersonalization," to confirm your commitment to consciousness transformation. What if I told you that Joel Goldsmith discovered a spiritual truth so radical that religious institutions tried to suppress it? A revelation that could dissolve every limitation you face, but threatens the very foundation of traditional religious control? This isn't theory. This is the mystical Christianity secret that changed thousands of lives and made denominations deeply uncomfortable. The discovery was simple, yet revolutionary. God is not a power that acts upon circumstances. God is the consciousness that you already are. Not a distant deity dispensing rewards and punishments, but the infinite presence expressing as your very existence. This understanding demolishes the need for intermediaries, rituals, and institutional authority. Churches teach you to beg, plead, and petition an external God. Joel discovered that such prayer actually reinforces separation and powerlessness. The forbidden truth: you don't ask God for anything because there is no separation between the divine consciousness and your true identity. Recognition replaces petition. Realization replaces begging. This threatened everything denominations built their power upon: the belief that you need them to reach God, that salvation comes through their doctrine, that spiritual authority resides in their hierarchy. Joel's discovery liberated seekers from spiritual dependence. That's why they wanted it erased. Joel Goldsmith didn't start as a radical mystic. He began as a traditional practitioner who prayed in conventional ways, asking God to heal, provide, and intervene. Results were inconsistent. Something fundamental was missing in his understanding. Then came the breakthrough that religious authorities would later condemn as dangerous heresy. During deep meditation, he realized that petitionary prayer assumes God doesn't already know your need, that divine will must be convinced or changed. This places God in time and space, subject to persuasion. But infinite consciousness cannot be influenced because it already is all-knowing, ever-present perfection. The problem wasn't God's willingness, it was human perception. The forbidden discovery crystallized. Spiritual healing happens not by asking God to change circumstances, but by recognizing that God consciousness is already present as the only power and presence. Nothing needs fixing because nothing is actually broken in divine reality. Human sense perception creates the illusion of lack, disease, conflict. Joel tested this radical approach with a woman named Dorothy who suffered severe chronic pain for years. Instead of asking God to heal her, he silently recognized the truth. Divine consciousness knows no pain, disease, or limitation. Within weeks of her practicing this recognition daily, her symptoms dissolved, not because God intervened, but because she awakened to what was already true. Traditional religion teaches that God responds to human behavior. Pray correctly and receive blessings, sin, and face punishment. Joel's forbidden discovery demolished this transactional theology completely. Divine consciousness doesn't react to human actions because infinite being transcends cause and effect. God simply is, eternally and unchangeably perfect. This understanding transforms everything. When you stop asking God to act and start recognizing God as the only actor, as the consciousness that you are, miracles become natural. Not supernatural interventions, but the natural emergence of harmony when human misperception dissolves. Churches couldn't accept this because it eliminated their role as necessary mediators. The technique Joel taught was revolutionary in its simplicity. Sit quietly and recognize that infinite consciousness is present where you are, not hoping it will arrive, but acknowledging its eternal presence. Recognize that this consciousness knows no lack, no disease, no conflict. Rest in that recognition without asking for anything to change. This wasn't positive thinking or affirmation. It was recognition of spiritual reality that already exists, has always existed, regardless of human perception. Like opening your eyes in a bright room and recognizing light was there all along. You don't create it. You simply stop denying it. Here's why denominations tried to erase this discovery. It makes organized religion optional. If you can directly recognize divine consciousness as your own being, you don't need priests, pastors, or institutional doctrine. Salvation isn't something you obtain through church membership. It's the eternal truth of your spiritual identity. Joel faced fierce opposition from religious authorities who accused him of blasphemy, pantheism, denying the personal God. But his students were experiencing profound transformations through this simple recognition practice. Financial lack dissolving not through asking for money, but recognizing divine abundance as already present. Relationships healing through recognition of divine love as the only presence. The forbidden secret wasn't complicated mysticism requiring years of study. It was accessible to anyone willing to stop begging an external God and start recognizing the divine consciousness that you are. This democratized spirituality, removing power from institutional gatekeepers. That's what made it dangerous to religious establishments. Joel taught that you practice recognition for weeks and months, not expecting instant results, but gradually training consciousness to see truth instead of human appearances. Each recognition dissolves a layer of false perception. Transformation comes through persistent recognition, not through hoping God will eventually answer your prayers. Let me share what happened when Robert, a business owner drowning in debt, discovered Joel's forbidden approach. For years he prayed desperately for financial rescue, asking God to send customers, open doors, provide opportunities. His business continued declining. Traditional prayer wasn't working because it reinforced his belief in lack as reality. Then Robert learned Joel's recognition technique. Instead of asking God to fix his finances, he spent 20 minutes each morning recognizing that divine consciousness knows no lack, that infinite abundance is the only reality. Not visualizing money or affirming prosperity, but simply acknowledging spiritual truth regardless of bank account appearances. The first 2 weeks nothing changed externally. Robert's mind fought the practice, insisting that recognizing abundance while bills piled up was denial of reality. But he persisted, understanding that he was training consciousness to see beyond human appearances. Recognition wasn't about changing circumstances, it was about awakening to truth. Within 6 weeks, unexpected opportunities emerged. Not because God finally answered prayers, but because Robert's consciousness shifted from lack belief to abundance recognition. Clients who had disappeared returned. New contracts appeared through unlikely connections. His business stabilized and began growing. The transformation came through consciousness change, not divine intervention. Amanda suffered from severe anxiety that medications barely controlled. She prayed constantly for God to take away her fear, grant her peace, calm her mind. The prayers seemed to bounce off heaven's ceiling. Traditional religious counseling offered no relief. Then she encountered Joel's forbidden discovery about recognition versus petition. Amanda learned to sit in silence and recognize that divine consciousness is peace itself, that perfect tranquility is the eternal nature of spiritual reality. Not asking for peace to arrive, but acknowledging peace as already present beneath the storm of human thoughts. This practice felt strange initially, like claiming sunshine during a hurricane. But Joel taught that you practice recognition, especially when appearances contradict it. That's how consciousness learns to see truth instead of human sense testimony. Amanda spent 15 minutes twice daily recognizing divine peace as present reality, regardless of anxious thoughts swirling through her mind. She didn't fight the anxiety or ask it to leave. Over 8 weeks, something shifted fundamentally. The anxiety didn't disappear instantly, but its grip weakened progressively. Amanda found herself responding to triggers with unexpected calmness. Not because she developed better coping mechanisms, but because consciousness was recognizing truth more consistently. Peace emerged naturally as recognition deepened. William and Michelle's marriage was collapsing after 22 years. Communication had deteriorated into hostile silence. They both prayed for God to fix their spouse, change attitudes, restore love. Traditional marriage counseling provided tools but no deep healing. The relationship seemed beyond repair. Then they discovered Joel's approach. Instead of asking God to change each other, they began recognizing that divine love is the only presence in their relationship. Not romantic feelings or emotional attachment, but the infinite love that is consciousness itself. This recognition practice required them to look past all human behavior and see spiritual truth. William practiced recognizing divine love as present even when Michelle criticized him. Michelle practiced recognizing divine harmony as reality even during arguments. They weren't pretending everything was fine or suppressing emotions. They were training consciousness to see beyond human conflict to spiritual truth that existed underneath. The transformation took 3 months of daily recognition practice. Gradually, something softened between them. Not because either changed their personality, but because both were seeing through different eyes. Recognition of divine love began dissolving the accumulated resentments. Their marriage didn't return to honeymoon romance, but found a deeper peace and respect based on spiritual recognition rather than emotional neediness. These stories reveal the power of Joel's forbidden discovery. When you stop asking God to act and start recognizing God as the only actor, as the consciousness that you are, transformation becomes natural, not through divine intervention, but through consciousness awakening to eternal truth. The technique churches tried to suppress works because it addresses the root issue, misperception of reality. Human sense testimony tells you lack is real, disease is real, conflict is real. Recognition reveals these as false appearances, shadows that dissolve when light of truth shines. Joel taught this isn't instant manifestation or magical thinking. It's the patient work of training consciousness over weeks and months to recognize spiritual truth consistently. Each recognition session plants seeds that germinate gradually. Some days you'll see no evidence of progress. That's when recognition practice matters most. If these transformation stories inspire you to discover Joel's forbidden technique for yourself, like this video so more seekers can find these suppressed teachings, subscribe for deeper mystical Christianity wisdom that churches won't teach, and comment, which recognition practice speaks to your situation right now? Beyond the basic recognition practice, Joel taught complementary techniques that enhance spiritual awakening. The first is what he called impersonalization, recognizing that what appears as human problem is actually impersonal false belief, not truth about any individual. This dissolves the tendency to personalize difficulties. When Daniel faced unexpected job loss, his first reaction was taking it personally. Something was wrong with him. He'd failed. He wasn't good enough. Joel's impersonalization technique taught him differently. Recognize that unemployment isn't personal truth about Daniel. It's impersonal appearance of lack belief in consciousness. Daniel practiced seeing the job loss as impersonal belief in limitation, not as truth about his identity or worth. This recognition lifted the emotional weight immediately. He wasn't a failure experiencing lack. He was consciousness witnessing false belief about limitation. Within this recognition, he could respond practically without psychological devastation. The impersonalization technique works with any challenge. Illness isn't personal affliction, it's impersonal belief in body as reality. Relationship conflict isn't personal attack, it's impersonal belief in separation. Financial struggle isn't personal inadequacy, it's impersonal belief in limited supply. Recognizing impersonal nature of problems transforms how consciousness responds. Joel's second complementary technique was the unconditioned mind practice. Traditional religion fills consciousness with conditions. If you're good enough, pray enough, believe correctly, then God will bless you. This conditioned thinking creates spiritual anxiety. Joel taught recognition of the unconditioned nature of divine being. Nicole struggled with perfectionism rooted in conditional religious teaching. She believed God's love depended on her spiritual performance. Joel's teaching shattered this. Divine consciousness has no conditions because infinity cannot be influenced. God's nature is unconditioned being, not reactionary blessing. Nicole practiced recognizing that divine love exists independent of her behavior, thoughts, or spiritual achievements. This wasn't license for irresponsibility, it was recognition of truth. She spent time daily acknowledging, divine consciousness simply is, requiring nothing from me, unchanged by my human actions. This recognition gradually dissolved her spiritual anxiety. She stopped performing for God's approval and began resting in eternal divine presence. Her spiritual practice shifted from earning favor to recognizing what already exists. Actions flowed from peace rather than fear. Relationships improved as she stopped projecting conditional love patterns onto others. The third technique Joel taught was recognition of supply as consciousness, not material accumulation. Traditional prosperity teaching focuses on getting more money, possessions, opportunities. Joel's forbidden approach recognized that abundance is the nature of consciousness itself, not dependent on external circumstances. Brian worked exhausting hours trying to create financial security. Despite success, anxiety persisted. There was never enough. Joel's teaching revealed why. He was seeking supply in form rather than recognizing supply as consciousness. Infinite abundance exists as spiritual reality, independent of bank accounts. Brian began practicing recognition that consciousness is supply, that divine intelligence is infinite resource expressing as all necessary form, not visualizing money or affirming wealth, but recognizing the omnipresence of divine abundance regardless of current financial appearances. This shifted his relationship with work completely. Within 4 months, Brian's income actually increased, but more importantly, his anxiety about money dissolved. He recognized abundance as consciousness truth rather than material accumulation goal. Work became expression of divine intelligence rather than desperate survival effort. Supply flowed naturally from consciousness recognition rather than human striving. Joel's fourth complementary technique addressed the deepest human fear: death. Traditional religion teaches death as reality requiring salvation. Joel's forbidden discovery revealed death as appearance, not truth of spiritual being. Consciousness is eternal, never born, never dying. This recognition dissolves existential fear. When Kevin's father received terminal diagnosis, the family was devastated. Kevin learned Joel's teaching. Recognize that life is consciousness, not physical form. Divine being knows no death because consciousness transcends material appearance. This wasn't denial of human experience, it was recognition of spiritual truth. Kevin practiced daily recognition that his father's true identity was eternal consciousness, not failing body. He recognized that life continues as consciousness regardless of form changes. This didn't prevent grief but transformed its nature. Kevin could support his father through transition without existential terror. His father, also practicing recognition in final months, experienced remarkable peace, not miraculous physical healing, but spiritual awakening to truth beyond form. When transition came, it was gentle passage rather than fearful ending. Kevin's recognition practice sustained him through loss because he knew consciousness as eternal reality. Now let's address realistic challenges you'll face practicing Joel's forbidden discovery. The first major obstacle is what Joel called taking thought, the mind's compulsion to analyze, plan, and control rather than rest in recognition. Traditional religion encourages mental activity, pray harder, understand better, figure out solutions. Stephanie began recognition practice with enthusiasm, but found her mind constantly interrupting. Instead of resting in divine presence, she'd start analyzing, am I doing this right? Why isn't it working? What should happen next? The mental activity blocked recognition completely. This is the most common obstacle. Joel taught that recognition requires releasing mental control. You're not trying to make something happen or understand how it works. You're simply acknowledging truth that already exists. When mind starts analyzing, gently return to recognition without judgment. The practice trains consciousness to rest rather than strive. Stephanie needed 6 weeks to quiet the mental commentary. Some days she'd spend entire sessions lost in thought, recognizing only in final moments. That's normal progress. Gradually, periods of pure recognition extended. The challenge wasn't failure, it was part of consciousness training. Patience with the process matters more than perfect execution. The second major challenge is expectation of immediate results. Modern culture conditions us for instant gratification. Joel's recognition practice works gradually, transforming consciousness layer by layer over weeks and months. When nothing changes quickly, disappointment and doubt arise. Jason practiced recognition for his business challenges, but expected dramatic results within days. When circumstances remained difficult after 2 weeks, he concluded the technique didn't work. This premature judgment aborted potential transformation. Joel warned against time-limited expectations. Divine consciousness operates outside human time. Recognition practice plants seeds in consciousness that germinate according to their own rhythm, not your preferred schedule. Some transformations emerge quickly, others require months of consistent practice. Judging effectiveness too soon blocks the very process that would eventually produce results. Jason resumed practice with different understanding. Recognition isn't bargaining with timeline, it's consciousness training regardless of apparent results. He committed to 3 months regardless of outcomes. Ironically, releasing expectation allowed transformation to unfold naturally. By month 2, significant changes emerged, but only because he'd stopped demanding immediate proof. The third challenge is practicing recognition while taking human action. Some misunderstand Joel's teaching as passive resignation. Just recognize truth and do nothing. But Joel taught that recognition informs action. It doesn't replace practical responsibility. The challenge is balancing spiritual recognition with human activity. Angela faced serious health issue requiring medical treatment. She worried that practicing recognition meant refusing medical help, that acknowledging divine perfection contradicted seeing doctors. This misunderstanding blocks many seekers. Joel taught that recognition and practical action aren't contradictory. Angela practiced recognizing divine wholeness as spiritual truth while simultaneously following medical protocol. Recognition didn't replace treatment, it transformed consciousness during treatment. She saw medical care as human tool consciousness could use while maintaining awareness of spiritual perfection as ultimate reality. This balanced approach allowed healing to unfold more effectively than either medical treatment alone or recognition without practical action. Consciousness remained rooted in spiritual truth while human form received necessary care. Joel taught that spiritual recognition enhances human activity by removing fear and resistance that block natural healing. The fourth challenge is maintaining recognition practice during crisis. Easy to recognize divine peace when life flows smoothly, difficult when chaos erupts. Traditional prayer feels more natural during emergency. Help me, fix this, intervene now. But crisis is exactly when recognition practice proves most powerful. Ryan faced sudden financial catastrophe when business partner embezzled funds. Every instinct screamed to panic, to beg God for rescue. Instead, he practiced Joel's teaching. Recognize divine consciousness as present power regardless of human circumstances. This felt almost impossible initially. But Joel taught that appearances of crisis are precisely when consciousness needs recognition most. Not to deny human experience, but to anchor awareness in spiritual truth beyond appearances. Ryan practiced recognizing divine intelligence as present. divine supply as reality, even while dealing practically with legal and financial consequences. The recognition practice didn't magically resolve the situation, but transformed how Ryan moved through it. Clarity emerged where panic would have clouded judgment. Solutions appeared that anxiety would have blocked. Within 8 months, he'd recovered financially and built stronger business. Recognition sustained him through storm by anchoring consciousness in truth beyond temporary chaos. If these challenge-breaking techniques resonate with your spiritual journey, like this video to help others discover freedom from religious conditioning, subscribe for advanced mystical practices churches suppress, and comment. Which obstacle do you face in recognition practice, and how will you approach it differently now? Let's explore advanced integration of Joel's forbidden discovery in daily life. The real test isn't formal meditation sessions, but spontaneous recognition during ordinary moments. Matthew learned this during business negotiation that triggered intense anxiety. Instead of praying for successful outcome, he paused internally and recognized divine intelligence as present. This wasn't about controlling negotiation results or gaining advantage. Matthew recognized that consciousness expressing as all parties was divine intelligence, that conflict was appearance not truth, that harmony existed as spiritual reality regardless of human disagreement. The recognition lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Something shifted in the meeting atmosphere. Matthew's anxiety dissolved, allowing clearer thinking and more authentic communication. The negotiation didn't magically resolve in his favor, but concluded with unexpected mutual understanding. This demonstrated recognition's power in real-time application. Joel taught that brief moments of recognition throughout daily activity gradually transform consciousness more effectively than only formal meditation sessions. Each spontaneous recognition reinforces spiritual awareness. Over months, recognition becomes natural response rather than special practice. Consciousness begins seeing spiritual truth first, rather than reacting to human appearances automatically. Lisa discovered advanced recognition practice through relationship challenge with her adult daughter. Years of conflict created painful distance. Traditional prayer had asked God to change her daughter's attitude, soften her heart, restore their relationship. Nothing changed because the prayer reinforced separation belief. Joel's advanced teaching recognized that there's no separation in consciousness, that divine love is the only presence expressing as both individuals. Not hoping they'd reconcile, but acknowledging that spiritual reality already perfect harmony. This recognition practice felt radical while experiencing actual alienation. Lisa practiced recognizing divine unity as truth each time painful memory surfaced or new conflict occurred. She didn't suppress emotions or pretend everything was fine. She felt the human pain while simultaneously recognizing spiritual truth beyond it. This dual awareness characterizes advanced practice. Gradually, over 9 months, something transformed. Her daughter reached out unexpectedly. Conversations softened. Old resentments dissolved without dramatic confrontation. The healing emerged naturally from consciousness shift rather than behavioral negotiation. Lisa's consistent recognition had changed the consciousness in which relationship existed. Jonathan faced advanced challenge with chronic health condition that persisted despite recognition practice. He'd practiced for 6 months, recognizing divine wholeness, yet symptoms continued. This is where many abandon the path, concluding it doesn't work. Joel addressed this challenge directly in his advanced teachings. Some physical conditions resolve quickly through recognition. Others persist as consciousness works through deeper layers of false belief. The temptation is judging practice by physical results rather than by consciousness transformation occurring beneath surface. Jonathan's challenge was maintaining recognition without demanding physical proof. Joel taught that sometimes physical healing represents final stage of consciousness awakening that's happening throughout recognition practice. The real transformation occurs in how you relate to condition, with fear or with peace, with resistance or with acceptance, while recognizing spiritual truth. Jonathan continued recognition practice without attaching to physical outcome. Ironically, this surrender of demand for results created space for healing to emerge naturally. After 11 months total practice, symptoms began subsiding. But more importantly, Jonathan had transformed his consciousness around health, fear, and trust, regardless of physical condition. The most advanced application of Joel's forbidden discovery is recognizing divine consciousness present in those who appear as enemies or adversaries. Traditional religion teaches to pray for enemies, asking God to change them. Joel's advanced recognition acknowledges divine consciousness as the only presence, even in those who seem harmful. When Ashley faced a workplace situation with supervisor who seemed determined to undermine her, every human instinct wanted to fight back, defend, retaliate. Joel's advanced teaching required recognizing divine consciousness as expressing even as this difficult person, seeing beyond human behavior to spiritual identity. This wasn't condoning harmful behavior or accepting mistreatment. Ashley maintained appropriate boundaries and documentation while practicing recognition that spiritual truth about this supervisor was divine consciousness, not the hostile human behavior. This recognition transformed her internal experience completely. The external situation resolved gradually, as Ashley's consciousness no longer fed the conflict energy. The supervisor's behavior shifted not because Ashley prayed for change, but because consciousness in which interaction occurred had transformed through recognition. This advanced practice demonstrates ultimate freedom, recognizing divine presence everywhere, in everyone, regardless of appearances. As we enter final integration of Joel's forbidden discovery, recognize that you've received what denominations tried to erase: direct access to divine consciousness without institutional mediation. You don't need church approval, pastoral blessing, or denominational authority to practice recognition of spiritual truth. This is your liberation. The path forward requires consistent practice over months and years, not desperate seeking for quick fixes. Joel compared consciousness transformation to ocean tides: gradual, powerful, inevitable when aligned with spiritual principle. Each recognition session, whether dramatic or ordinary, contributes to consciousness awakening. You'll face days when recognition feels impossible, when human appearances overwhelm spiritual awareness. That's when practice matters most. Not judging yourself for struggling, but gently returning to recognition of truth beyond appearances. Consciousness learns through repetition, through patient, persistent recognition, regardless of temporary evidence. The forbidden discovery transforms life not by changing external circumstances, but by awakening consciousness to spiritual reality that was always present. Financial challenges, health issues, relationship conflicts don't disappear magically. They're met with consciousness rooted in divine truth rather than human fear. That shift changes everything. Joel Goldsmith left you a precious gift that religious institutions wanted hidden: the understanding that God is not a power acting upon your life, but the consciousness that you are. This recognition dissolves every limitation, because limitations exist only in false human perception, never in divine reality. The technique is simple but requires dedication. Sit quietly daily and recognize that infinite consciousness is present now, not later. Recognize that this consciousness knows no lack, no disease, no conflict, no death. Not hoping these will disappear, but acknowledging they're not truth about spiritual reality. Practice impersonalization. See challenges as impersonal false beliefs, not personal afflictions. Develop unconditioned consciousness. Recognize divine being requires nothing from you, depends on no human action. Recognize supply as consciousness, not material accumulation. These complementary practices deepen primary recognition. You'll encounter obstacles, mental activity, expectation of instant results, difficulty balancing recognition with action, maintaining practice during crisis. These aren't failures, they're part of consciousness training. Joel spent decades developing recognition consciousness. Give yourself weeks and months, not days. Transformation comes through patient, persistent practice. The advanced applications reveal recognition's true power: spontaneous awareness during daily challenges, relationship transformation through unity consciousness, healing that emerges from consciousness shift rather than desperate prayer, even recognizing divine presence in apparent enemies. These aren't special achievements, they're natural unfoldment of consistent practice. Some transformations will appear quickly, others require months or years. Physical healing may come last even while consciousness transformation happens throughout. Don't measure success by external results alone. The real victory is consciousness that remains rooted in spiritual truth, regardless of human appearances. Churches tried to erase this discovery because it threatens institutional power. When individuals recognize direct access to divine consciousness, religious authority becomes optional. Joel never intended to destroy organized religion, only to free seekers from dependence on external mediation for spiritual realization. Your practice honors Joel's courage in teaching what denominations condemned. Each recognition session validates that spiritual truth transcends institutional control. You're not rebelling against religion, you're awakening to mystical Christianity that existed before denominations created dogma and hierarchy. You now possess the forbidden knowledge that could transform your life completely. Recognition replaces petition, realization replaces begging. Consciousness awakening replaces hoping for divine intervention. God is not distant power you must convince, but infinite presence you recognize as your true identity. Begin today with 20 minutes of recognition practice. Sit quietly and acknowledge divine consciousness as present now. Recognize that this consciousness knows no limitation of any kind. Don't ask for anything to change, simply recognize truth that already exists. Practice this daily for 3 months minimum. When challenges arise, practice spontaneous recognition. Brief pause to acknowledge divine presence regardless of appearances. When relationships conflict, recognize unity beneath apparent separation. When health falters, recognize divine wholeness as spiritual truth. When finances struggle, recognize consciousness as infinite supply. The denominations that tried to erase Joel's discovery feared your liberation from spiritual dependence. They wanted you believing salvation comes through their authority. Joel revealed that salvation is recognizing the divine consciousness you already are. This recognition practice is your freedom. If Joel Goldsmith's forbidden discovery has illuminated your spiritual path today, like this video so this suppressed wisdom reaches others ready for transformation. Subscribe to continue receiving mystical Christianity, secrets churches won't teach, and comment, "I recognize divine consciousness," to confirm your commitment to this liberating practice.